So Tim, if you were trying to encourage a friend or a family member to watch Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2, what would you say to them to encourage them to watch? I mean, what would your sales pitch be?
That's a great question. In fact, it's such a good question. I've not been asked that question
well,
before.
I am the first. That's great.
Yeah. I would probably say that most people will never be able to go to the locations of the Bible. And I'm going to take you on an adventure. I'm going to show you people who've been searching, in fact, actually risking their lives, sometimes being arrested, to uncover what could be the real location of Mount Sinai. And you're going to hear their story. You're going to see locations that, if we're correct, might be the very things that the Israelites saw when they came to the mountain. I'm going to show you biblical archeology that, well, some would say it's biblical, but it's ancient. Well, let's put it this way, that we're going to look for a pattern. As a patterns of evidence film, which we looked at Journey to Mount Sinai, we're looking for evidences that are giving us, there's clues in the scripture that are pointing to certain events and activities that happen, such as they built an altar, or they had 12 pillars, that there was a massive killing of 3,000 people, that there should be sources of water. So we're going to look for those kinds of clues. So if you like investigations, if you enjoy that kind of thing,
archeology,
if you like archeology,
blend that all together
in the Bible, that's what we're doing.
That's great. So for every filmmaker, there always seems to be a trigger point or a tipping point where you come to this place where you say to yourself, I need to create this, or I need to produce this story. What was that moment for you with this project?
In 2003, I had an invitation to go to Saudi Arabia, and I was afraid because 2002 we had the terrorist attack in September, but yet I was going to the location that, you know, in some ways that Bin Laden and his people, you know, were from, and but yet I also felt that I had known about the fact that there was photography coming out of this location that was matching the Bible, and so it made me very interested. And when that opportunity came, I decided to take it. And that's how I got started on this investigation, because I thought there's a door that's open for a little bit. What were the odds? In fact, one of the things we said was, what are the odds that we could actually go to that location? So was there any one shining moment or one particular thing that made you want to chase this and try to find and discover the true location of Mount Sinai? I think there are multiple things. First of all, there is a couple. Their names was Jim and Penny Caldwell. Okay. I had heard that this couple had lived in Saudi Arabia and that they had been documenting what they thought was the real location of Mount Sinai. In fact, I didn't know their names in the beginning. I just was told that there's a couple, and they've just come out of Saudi Arabia. And we set up a phone call. And I had another gentleman with me, Dr. Leonard Moeller. He was from Sweden. He was a Swedish, he was a DNA research scientist. He was visiting me. I had invited him to come and meet with me, and he came over. It felt as if there was something more happening than just natural, that there was the providence of God sort of lining things. And while he was visiting, I got this phone call from Jerusalem about this couple, and no names were given at the time, and they had to find out if we were willing to talk. And then we finally had this call.
That sounds kind of covert.
It does. It felt that way too. That. Yeah, you know, because you're trying to figure out who can you trust, and so in that particular case, it was a pretty amazing phone call that we had. It was also interesting was that when we started talking to the Caldwells, Jim was telling us when he reached the top of this mountain, and he said that he got there on his birthday. And I didn't know anything about, why that would be curious, but Dr. Moeller said, and then we also found out that he climbed the next mountain like 2 years later, not Dr. Moeller, but Jim Caldwell, on his birthday again. And Moeller said to him, he says, well, that's very interesting, because I have the very same birthday. And then he said, what year were you born?
Oh boy, here we go.
They're born the same year. So it just sort of, you're on this phone call, you're meeting these people for the first time. They both are interested, two men from other parts of the world are interested in the same mountain, and they're born on the very same day. Now, some people say, well, that's just a coincidence. But there are a number of interesting coincidences that we experience. But that's how we started that phone call. And from there, we heard about the opportunity to possibly get into the country, which the Caldwells were shocked by, because no one
were able to get in.
Yeah, we could possibly get a tour to the locations, and so we all thought, well, the way to kind of test this out is to see if they accept us. So we put our names in, and a couple weeks later, they said, yes, you can go. We told them where we wanted to go, and that began in 2003, my first experience really searching for the location of Mount Sinai. And so that was the kind of the
That's neat.
provocative thing that happened.
Yeah. So after 3,500 years, I guess it is, yeah, is there still evidence for the mountain where Moses and the Israelites met God? I mean, can it still be found? I mean, simply put, what did you find when you went there?
Yeah, great question. And the thing that's interesting is that when you're doing an investigation like this, some of the things don't change. For example, mountains don't change. Deserts can change a little bit as far as, or wildernesses, but the geography you can still look for. So when you're looking at the scriptures, you're measuring geographical anomalies or geographical landmarks to see where things are. One of them is the sea. For example, what sea was crossed? And you say, well, why is that important? Well, because the journey ends at a sea, at a part of it, and then it picks up again on the other side. Okay. So when you're looking for those indicators, one of the things that I felt as I've looked at it was that the first films that I made earlier on the Red Sea Miracle had to deal with what sea was crossed. And in that particular investigation, I was looking towards the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the right arm of the Red Sea. And when you look at these, if the Israelites crossed earlier up near the Bitter Lakes and these little shallow lakey, marshy areas, then the mountain could be anywhere. But if they crossed at the Gulf of Aqaba, then they would be in Saudi Arabia, present-day Saudi Arabia. So that gives you a clue. Now, what had happened was there's a number of biblical references that I was looking at, and every time they identify the location of the word Yam Suf, which is the
Yam Suf.
Yam, yeah, Y-A-M-S-U-P-H, Yam Suf. Yam means sea, Suf, what does that mean? And that became the big question for let's say over 1,000 years. Does it mean reeds? Does it mean weedy? Does it mean boundary or edge? But what's curious is that when Moses gives the boundary of Israel, that he uses the word Yam Suf as the southern boundary, and that points you to the Gulf of Aqaba, the right arm of the Red Sea. And so that then gives you some indication. So I'm giving you physical evidence, or geographical evidence of where we might start to look for the search. But people have rejected that for a couple of reasons, because of tradition. Later on, traditions, moved the sea away from a sea into marshy lakes because of the miraculous. They were concerned about, how could the sea be parted, a deep sea be parted? Number two, there is also the concern about, distance. How far could people travel? Could they have traveled that far? And when you start to look at practically and chart things out, then you can start to see, were they close by Egypt? Was this a story that's near Egypt, or is it further away?
It's almost like you go through a checklist.
Yeah.
And go through, and I think you have something you call the Mount Sinai scorecard.
Yeah.
Is that related to this? How you check against, it's like you're doing a proof to make sure it checks all the boxes.
Exactly.
How does that work?
Yeah, so in this investigation, we had the journey. That was part of it. Then we had Midian, the ancient land of Midian. And then we had other things like attributes and archeological artifacts and things like that. So I found that was the most practical way to keep score. And so I was working on this early in the fall of last year, And I go, man, there's a lot of information here. How do we keep track of it?
Yeah.
And that's when we came up with the Mount Sinai scorecard, which I'm sort of joking here, but it's like bowling for Mount Sinai. You've got strikes and then spares and then gutter balls. And so the question is, as you look through each of the mountains, because there's 2 films, Journey to Mount Sinai 1 and Journey to Mount Sinai 2. It's over 4 hours of investigation. And when you look at those, what you're looking for is this mountain that has been suggested adding up? Because the one thing I found out was that people sometimes, very intelligent people, saw 1 or 2 things and they go, hey, that might be Mount Sinai. And you're like, yeah, but it's got some problems with the other areas. But they didn't think about them.
Right.
It's pretty simple. If you look through the whole text and you can then say, this is the checklist, then you're like, well, we better check this off. How do we deal with all these different problems? And then you just make a checklist. That's what we did.
That's neat how you go about that, the process of it all. Yeah. For me personally, I mean, I have always been fascinated by archaeology and how it connects to our modern world and how what's in it for me? How does it relate to me, so to speak? But sadly, that's not the case for many people. Why should archaeology be important to Christians? I think it's key, it's crucial. But your thoughts on that?
Well, what I've learned after this 20 years or so is that I didn't know that biblical archaeology has become taboo for some people, for universities. So a lot of the mainstream colleges have come to a conclusion that when they didn't find any evidence, let's say 30, 40, 50 years ago, what related to Jericho and related to other locations, they basically then became, the Bible isn't historical. It's just a story just a book of good stories. But what we started to see, and what my films have been investigating is well, what is the premise that you're making that conclusion on? Right. And that's when we started looking for a pattern of evidence. And so you could say, well, why is this not, why is this important today? Why should I care? Because a lot of people say, hey, I believe because I believe. I just have faith. Right. But if you go and send your daughter or your son or your grandchildren to college, they're going to be told that the Bible doesn't have any historical credibility. Right. And they're going to be told that these are just fairy tales. And by the way, Jesus talks about Moses, Jesus and Stephen when he's being stoned, the disciples, Paul, they all reference back, even the prophets all reference back to the events of the Exodus. In fact, it says almost, I don't know how many times, but it says, do not forget, like 100 to 150 times.
Do not forget.
What God did by bringing you up out of Egypt.
But yet people forgot.
And people forget because they don't think it's true. Right. And when I talked to one scholar who is an agnostic, I said, but then what does that mean for Jesus? And he just smiles and goes, yep, not true. Jesus isn't the Son of God. And what does that then? So I've actually had students that come to me and parents that have come to me and said, my son came back from college after one semester and said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in this Bible and I don't believe in God because I've been enlightened. And I've been to seminaries that are very secular, and nobody in the seminary believes, even maybe there might be a God, but they certainly don't believe in any of these events, and they don't believe in Jesus. And so what happens is that's why we're seeing, not in every reason, but many people falling away, their children falling away because they don't think there's any truth to it. That's the battle.
Wow. So at this point, you've made several films. What sets this one and the film series, because it's a 2-part series, what sets it apart from other documentaries that you've made in the past?
Well, I've been focused on this particular one. I'm working into my 10th, 12th film.
You've done a lot.
So yeah, there's a few of them. I think that the thing that's been, I guess, good for me is that I started here 20 years ago, and I've completed a series up to a point. So if you're asking the question about did the Exodus happen, if anybody has that question, well, I've got 6 films, 12 hours to investigate, plus a lot of ancillary content that can help. And so for me, there is a strong pattern of evidence, and I've never done this before. I'm going to give my opinion in this film, which I've always left open.
You've always tried to stay neutral.
I've always stayed neutral. I've never given anybody what I think.
Let the facts speak for themselves,
right.
basically.
But it's going to pretty much, because of the use of the scorecard, I'm going to say, well, I'm not saying this is for sure, but I'm going to say this really looks strong. And that's what I'm going to do. That's something I've never done before in any of the films.
That's great. You know, for me, this film really demonstrates the power of God in sustaining the children of Israel during what is known as a foundational biblical event. How do these events that happened so long ago, how do they apply to our culture today?
Well, I think that one thing that comes to my mind is that God made a covenant with the people of Israel, that they would, and that's the thing that was interesting for me, is that into that covenant ceremony, the Israelites were to come to the mountain to worship God. And I think the thing, when I'm making a film, I'm asking the same questions, like, why am I making this? Why is this important for me today? I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but we were created actually for a purpose. And one of the fundamental purposes is that we're created to worship God. The challenge is that most of us don't know that. We think we're created to have a good time and to live life to its fullest and to enjoy everything that you can. But at Mount Sinai, God actually gives commandments. And the Israelites were told to actually wash their clothes in preparation to meet God. These slaves that came out of Egypt, they traveled through this desert. There are miracles that happen. God actually comes to the mountain. There's earthquakes. There's like lightning. I mean, it's a scary thing. And in fact, when they hear his voice, they tremble. And they make a covenant with God. And so what I learned about this is that in my own trials, in my own life, I felt that God was calling me, and I put this in the film, calling us to worship God. And I don't mean just on Sunday morning, but to actually change my life.
Foundational part of your life.
Foundational part of my life. To actually move into a form of worshiping of God every day. And because I play music, and when I'm able to, what that means for me now is that I'll take the guitar out and I will sing and worship God. Now, for some of us, it might be just finding the CD and singing along with it. But I think that there's something that God will give to us that we don't have just by our own nature. That there's some type of healing, renewing, and strengthening that we're going to experience by spending time worshiping God. And I think that's the message for me in the making of this film, and that's the message that I felt I needed to share with people.
When you're working on these films, you're very closely associated with the subject matter and the content, and it gets personal, I'm sure. Yeah. What did you learn about your faith through working on this project?
The Israelites were fearful. They were fearing a lot. And I think that we are very much like the Israelites. You can either fear, and you can also complain. And God basically took them out of Egypt after many miraculous plagues that happened. He parted the water. Then they complained about not having any water on the other side, and he gave them water. He gave them food. And I'm no different than the Israelites. I actually have recorded all the things that God has provided at different times. And I think I would say this to the audience is that think about and spend some time writing down all the things that God has done for your family, for your parents, maybe your grandparents. Tell this story, write this history down, and remember it. Don't forget the things that God has done. And that's what God was trying to tell the Israelites. So my thinking is that the sad part is that the Israelites, the main body of people, after seeing all of this, they still couldn't trust God. What he wanted to give them, the land that he had promised Abraham, they basically didn't trust him. And they complained. And I don't want to be like that. And I shared that in the film. I don't want to be a complainer. And because then God said, okay, I'm done with you. Yeah. You're not making it into the promised land. And I think we have to be very careful with how we complain. and how ungrateful we are. So I think we need to rethink our relationship.
Wow. A commonly held belief, at least for me anyway, is that the past, our past, informs our future. With that said, we're talking about an area and an event that happened thousands of years ago, but here we are in the present day. Why is right now the right time for this film to be coming out for people to see?
Well, I'm going to answer that with two answers.
Okay.
So if we think about a generation as being 35 years, and I'm going to throw out, what is a generation? It could be 40, 35. I'm going to choose 35.
We'll use 35.
Because it's easy math for me.
Okay.
35 years and then you have a child. And then 35 years later, they have a child. It's only 100 generations ago, back to the past of the Exodus. Only 100. When I flew here on an airplane, there's probably 200 and some seats.
Sure.
Well, I don't know if you went to a congregation of 100 people, it's pretty small. You could see them all sitting there. We think that these things happened a long time ago, but in the span of the universe, in the span of time, like I've created a wall of time, and you look at how narrow things are. Things haven't happened that long ago. I believe that one of the things that I didn't know, because I made a film on Revelation, I helped produce a film on the 7 churches of Revelation. What I read when reading in Revelation, I don't know if you know this, but in the Bible says towards the end of time, the end of this age, the plagues of the Exodus are coming back. We're going to see the repeat of people that are in rebellion. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there are many people that are in rebellion to God, and God is trying to wake them up. And here we are in the midst of that rebellion. And so I'm just saying that I had no clue that the plagues of the Exodus would repeat themselves. And there's sort of like a type and shadow of ancient events that then repeat themselves. And then there's the deliverance. There will be the deliverance from this fallen world. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that God uses these films for a lot of people who are skeptical, and there's a lot of what would you call them, prodigals. And I've seen the prodigals watch a film like this, and they go, it might be true. If it's true, it changes everything. Sure. A lot of people are comfortable if it's not true. It gives them freedom, but the freedom from God is what they think they're getting. But I think as a believer, you realize that that's not real freedom. So,
after audiences have had a chance to see Journey to Mount Sinai 2, what would you like to see them take away from the viewing experience? I mean, what's your greatest hope for this film?
Yeah. I think I asked one man this one time early on, one of my first films. And what was interesting, what he said was, it made me bold. It strengthened him. It helped him to feel like, I need to share that this is real. This is true. And the films I've made, the body of work that I've been fortunate to do, has actually made a lot of people very bold. And they feel like, yeah, these things really happen. And, throughout history, this is not an unusual phenomenon where people are wanting to know where the places are. Where was Christ born? Where is Calvary? There's just this part of sort of a sense of belonging to history, belonging to part of it. That's one thing. I think I think there's a sense of boldness. For others, I think it's a sense of, well, if it's true, it changes everything. Then I need to change the way I'm living, because I thought this was a fairy tale. That's what my professor said, but now you're telling me it's not? And I've had startling reactions. I once had an atheist, I was in Philadelphia, showing it at a synagogue, one of the very first films. And the man came in and he goes, yeah, I'm an atheist. I don't believe any of this stuff. Yeah, it's
nice to meet you too, sir.
Yeah. That's where he came in. He went out leaping and saying, it's true, it's true. I never knew that it was true, but it's true.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it was incredible. There's another situation that happened too. I was at a conference, and a woman, young college girl, African she was African American. She had converted to Christianity and came to America. And she went to this college. Actually, it was like a Christian college, quote unquote. And the professor told her that there was no historical truth or reality.
At a Christian college? Yeah. That's sad. Very sad.
And to this event, but it's a great story, great literature. And she went back to her dorm absolutely devastated. She said, "Why did I do this if this isn't real?" And a girl that was there said, "Why are you so unhappy?" And she told her what happened. And the woman said, "You need to see patterns of evidence." And she says, "What's that?" And so she ended up finding it online, and she watched it. She kind of stayed up through the night, took all sorts of notes, and went to the professor the next day and said, "You are wrong."
And here's why.
Yeah, and she said, "You need to see patterns of evidence. There is evidence for the Exodus." And I can tell you, he basically said, "What are you talking about?" And then he ended up watching it. You know what? The good news is that woman didn't lose her faith. Her faith was incredibly strengthened. The professor changed the course, and he changed the test. And that's an example of showing that there's a pattern of evidence.
That's great. I understand the initial run of the film was last week.
Yeah.
With that said, how can we see the film? Where can we see it? What platform? I'm sure it'll be available in streaming somewhere, but tell me where people can see this.
Yeah, great. I'd love to do that. Patternsofevidence.com. If you're interested in Bible and archaeology and history, if you're interested in films that are shareable with your family and friends that are skeptic, I make these films that are multi-points of view, so some people wonder, well, where's this going? Because you're hearing from different voices. Patternsofevidence.com. Patternsofevidence.com. We've got you'll be able to see where the store is, and if you want to sign up, you can get Thinker updates that basically will give you more information about what's happening. We've got a podcast now and a YouTube channel.
What's the name of the podcast?
I think it's Pattern of Evidence.
Okay, that's easy to remember.
Yeah, we're trying to keep it simple. Yeah. So, yeah.
I realize this film has just coming out, but I always like to ask people when I interview them, are you working on anything new that you can share about? So, Tim, I ask you that question. Is there anything new you can share?
Well, thank you, yeah. We're continuing with Patterns of Evidence films. We're going to basically look at the Ark of the Covenant. It was built, the tabernacle was built at Mount Sinai. Well, where is the Ark of the Covenant? And then from there, we're going on to the conquest and looking at giants. We're going to look at evidences for the conquest of archaeological. And so that's the Patterns of Evidence side. We're also looking at the New Testament in doing the prophecy of Messiah coming. So that's going to be coming in the future. And now we're working with Michael Medved.
Yes, he's great.
Yeah, we've got a whole new, he wrote a book called The American Miracle. And so we're going to be developing this into a full feature film.
Wonderful.
And it will be a mainly drama with some documentation from major mainstream scholars. And that is coming out in 2025 because we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of America.
Yes, we are. Not too far away. Not too far away at all. Well, that's great. That's fantastic. Well, the current project, once again, is called Journey to Mount Sinai 2. And it's available right now. Just go to the Patterns of Evidence website. He's Tim Mahoney. Tim, thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.